Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to talk about the 20th century in Europe, a time when it feels like they took the entire rulebook for reality and just, well, set it on fire. Everything from truth and art to the very idea of God was suddenly up for grabs.
You see, for centuries, Europe was powered by this idea of progress, the belief that science and reason were on this unstoppable, one-way march toward a better future. But then, the 20th century came along, slammed on the brakes, and asked a question that would change everything.
I mean, just look at the contrast. On one side, you've got the Enlightenment, promising a world built on perfect logic, and on the other, you have the grim reality of two world wars, where the tools of progress were used for mass destruction. It was this massive, head-on collision that forced everybody to rethink everything.
Okay, so let's get right into it. We're diving into the intellectual ground zero of this whole shift. Just try to imagine you're a thinker at the time. You look around, and the world just doesn't make sense anymore. The old rulebook is totally useless. It was time to write a new one, for a reality that had gone completely off the rails.
And believe it or not, even before the century really got going, a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche saw it coming. Now, this famous quote, it wasn't a celebration. He wasn't popping champagne, it was a warning. He was basically saying that the very foundations of meaning and morality, which for so long were tied to religion, were starting to crumble. And he worried that Europe was about to stare into a massive abyss.
And out of that abyss, you get this thing called existentialism. The best way to think about it is like this. Imagine someone hands you a totally blank canvas and says, there are no rules, paint whatever you want. It's an incredible amount of freedom, right? But it's also kind of terrifying, because now you have to create meaning out of absolutely nothing. That's existentialism in a nutshell.
Postmodernism then took that idea and just cranked it up to 11. It started asking, well, what if there's no such thing as one single, capital T, truth at all? You know, what one culture sees as brave, another might see as totally reckless. It all just depends on your point of view. So maybe my truth isn't your truth, and for a postmodernist, that's perfectly okay.
So, you might be wondering, if philosophers are saying God is dead and truth is relative, what about all those churches on every street corner? Did they just pack up and go home? Well, the answer is a lot more complicated and way more political than you might think.
Oh, far from it. Religion didn't disappear. It dug in. It adapted, it fought back, and it ended up right in the middle of the century's biggest struggles. Sometimes it was an incredible force for resistance, and other times it was a tool in the hands of the powerful. And this is where it gets really fascinating, because you see religion playing all sides. On one hand, you have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German pastor who risked everything to stand up to the Nazis. But then you flip the coin, and you see the Vatican making a deal with Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, which gave him a huge boost of legitimacy. And then decades later, you get a Polish Pope, John Paul II, who becomes this global symbol of the fight against communism. It just goes to show you, religion was never one single thing. It was a human institution, full of courage and, at times, some very tough compromises.
And the Catholic Church itself knew it couldn't just stand still. In the 1960s, they held this massive meeting called the Second Vatican Council, and it was a huge deal. They started letting Mass be held in local languages instead of just Latin, and they reached out to other Christian groups. They were trying to throw open the doors and show a modern world that they were still relevant.
Now, all this soul-searching, all this questioning of authority, it wasn't just happening in books and in churches. It absolutely exploded onto the canvas. I mean, think about it. If reality itself isn't a fixed, certain thing anymore, how in the world are you supposed to paint it? And this is the key. It's like the difference between a photograph and a diary entry. A photo shows you what someone looks like, right? But a diary tells you what they're feeling inside. Artists in the 20th century got way more interested in the diary. They wanted to paint the feeling of modern life, all the anxiety, the dreams, the confusion. And wow, did it lead to an explosion of new ideas. You get Cubism, which just shatters a single viewpoint into a dozen pieces. You get Dadaism, which was basically one giant satirical joke mocking the whole idea of art. Surrealism tried to paint our dreams. And even architecture changed. Bauhaus came along and stripped buildings down to their bare essentials, saying form follows function.
And it wasn't just painters. Writers were tearing up the rulebook too. You have James Joyce, who tried to capture every single random thought flitting through a character's mind all day long. It's messy and it's chaotic, just like real life. And then there's Franz Kafka, who wrote these stories that feel like those anxiety dreams we've all had, where you're trapped in a system that makes no sense.
Okay, so we've covered philosophy and art. But how did all these huge ideas actually affect regular people on the streets?
how did it change society itself?
Well, after the absolute devastation of World War II, something really unexpected happened in Western Europe. An economic miracle. The very same factories that were making tanks were suddenly pumping out cars and washing machines. For the first time, a lot of people had disposable income, and a new era of consumerism was born.
And with all that new money came, well, a lot of new people. Governments, desperate to rebuild, were actively encouraging families to have more kids with things like paid maternity leave, and the result, you guessed it, the baby boom. But here's the twist. All this prosperity and all these neat suburban houses created this feeling of conformity, and for a lot of people, it felt suffocating. The kids of this baby boom, the first generation to grow up with TV and rock and roll, started looking at their parents' world and asking, wait, is this all there is? People who were left out of the picture, women, minorities, students, they weren't going to stay quiet anymore.
And that discontent absolutely exploded in France in May of 1968. It started with a few students protesting old-fashioned rules at their university, but it just tapped into this widespread frustration. Before you knew it, it wasn't just students. 10 million workers went on strike. The entire country just stopped. For a moment there, it really felt like the whole system might actually come crashing down.
And so, that's the legacy we're left with. The 20th century took the old, single picture of reality and shattered it into a million different pieces. It left us with a world full of individual perspectives, which brings us to the big question we're still wrestling with today.